Thanks so much, everybody. Welcome to this session of Family Mediation Week 2024 on mediation and domestic abuse, as you can see from the slide. So a warm welcome to everyone. Before we move on to the introductions, just a bit of housekeeping. Today's session is being recorded and you will have been asked for your consent prior to entering the session. The recording will be available on the website of the Family Mediation Council after Family Mediation Week has finished. So please tell your colleagues who weren't able to attend today. We've prepared some slides for the presentation today, and they will be available to send out after the session. And there will be time at the end of the slide presentation for questions. Please can you put your questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and we'll answer them after the slides have been taken down. We're being very ably assisted by Julie Perry in the background. Thanks, Julie. If we could have the next slide, please. So just to introduce myself, I'm a family solicitor, a collaborative lawyer, and an accredited child inclusive mediator. I supervise other mediators as their professional practice consultant, and I also supervise family lawyers as a family law supervisor. I'm also a trainer. I'm a member of Resolution, which is a membership organisation of around 6,500 family justice professionals, and I'm the Vice Chair of the National Resolution Dispute Resolution Committee. So in other words, that committee is concerned with all aspects of family law, but particularly those outside the court space. I've been trained by the High Conflict Institute of America to conduct mediations involving high conflict, and I've also been trained by the Institute as a mediation coach for separated parents who are in high conflict situations. So I do this work for a charity called Shared Parenting Scotland, who run a programme for separated parents where there is high conflict. I've also worked as for the Home Office as a truth facilitator for the Truth Project arm of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. I train family lawyers and mediators in domestic abuse and safeguarding, and I also train them about high conflict personalities. Could we have the next slide, please? And over to you, Liza.
Thanks, Elaine. Hi, everybody. I'm Liza Thompson, and I'm just going to give you a little introduction into how come I'm speaking with you today. So I trained as an IDVA in 2010. This was following the completion of a law and social policy degree, and I worked up to senior IDVA. And then following the service manager of the charity leaving, I took over as the service manager, completed the accreditation with Safe Lives, and then stepped into the role of CEO in 2013. So that like a career progression pathway that can only happen in the women's charity sector very quickly. I led Satida, a domestic abuse charity based in Kent, until 2021, when I took the plunge into becoming a freelance statutory review writer. So now I write domestic homicide reviews, safeguarding adult reviews, and offensive weapon homicide reviews across the country. I also lecture and train professionals and lecture at universities on domestic abuse and coercive control. Next slide, please. So the title of today's session is There is Another Way. And what we mean by this is there is another way other than court for separating couples and families. So I'm going to start my part of the session by introducing how and why I became linked in with the mediation world, despite being a domestic abuse specialist and being trained throughout my whole time within the domestic abuse world to avoid mediation at all costs. So following my section, I'm going to pass back over to Elaine, who's going to speak about mediation itself and the different model options available to utilise when working with a couple where there's an uneven power dynamic, or it is known or suspected that one party is or has been abusive. I'm going to start by saying something that I'm sure you're all very well aware of. Human beings are messy and they're complex. Their relationships with one another are interconnected in so many different ways, and it's not possible to sort out only one small element of a person's life without it touching upon other elements. So when you then add in another party, children, extended family members, you can see how all of the elements of each individual's lives has a knock-on effect on those that they are interconnected with. And the puzzle pieces on these slides illustrate this interconnectedness. We really want to make this session a safe space to explore and discuss concerns or worries. We've hopefully left a nice amount of time at the end to answer questions, and I really hope that this will generate some sort of discussion, but then thoughts for you to take away from the session. We will welcome an open dialogue, but also respectful challenge. So if you have any questions as we speak, please just pop them in the chat and we'll come to questions at the end. We're also going to share our contacts at the end if anyone wants to follow up on the conversation or anything that we've said. Next slide, please. So between 2013 and 2019, I worked towards my doctorate. So the thesis of this was entitled Impossible Expectations, a study of abused mothers within the child protection system. So my research was underpinned by Jennifer Nadelsky's theory of relational autonomy. And what Nadelsky argues is that every human being exists within a web of relations with other people, but also, importantly, with systems, laws, and structures. And these relationships are formative, meaning that they structure us as individuals. Obviously, some relationships are more formative than others. Part of what our relationships structure within us is our ability to be autonomous. So this is to make our own decisions, carve out our own path in life. To think and act autonomously is actually an ability that most of us take for granted, often until we don't have it anymore. So some relationships that we have, they promote autonomy. However, some very much negate autonomy. And abuse and coercion negates autonomy. And this is the end goal for an abuser, to remove the victim's sense of self. And often when we're speaking to victim survivors, we will hear the words of the abuser, even after many years of them separating. The abuse itself erodes a victim's sense of self and it negates their autonomy. And as domestic abuse specialists, it is our job to help them build this back up. So to help them to find their sense of self. And in essence, our role is to promote their autonomy. So what does this all have to do with mediation? So in 2020, as the pandemic hit, I was delivering training online to Medway Magistrates Court. There were all sorts of people there linked to the court, so judges, clerks, CAFCAS officers, and Helen Adam, who's an excellent mediator and a very, very forward-thinking individual. And she asked me the question, do you think mediation practices could promote the autonomy of a victim survivor? And this is how I became involved in the world of mediation. So obviously at that point, I couldn't say no and shut down that conversation. So I was forced to open my mind and to think about this logically. So forever in the domestic abuse world that I was working in, I'd been telling women that I supported and the staff that I employed, we do not use mediation. It was very much frowned upon, as much as it's frowned upon sending a perpetrator to anger management, which by the way is still okay. But I didn't know anything about mediation. All I knew about it was that it was something that we just bypass. We aim to get that box ticked that says no mediation. And as I said, Elaine's going to talk to us more about mediation techniques, but different techniques that can be used. But from the conversation I had with Helen, we then gathered a few others together and created the Mediation and Domestic Abuse Network. That's our logo, which I've noticed is quite blurry. Probably could have used a higher res logo there. So the purpose of the Mediation and Domestic Abuse Network is to bring mediators and domestic abuse specialists together to make sure that when a victim survivor wants to mediate and when it's safe to do so, they can work together as two sectors to ensure the uneven power dynamics are managed as much as possible, with the victim survivor being supported by their IDVA or their outreach worker throughout the process. Next slide, please. So from bringing together mediators and domestic abuse specialists, we have heard the worries, the concerns and the frustrations from both of the sectors. We've held a series of online events over the last few years, and we actually had a webinar at the 2021 Family Mediation Week. I was going to attempt to put the reports on the chat, but I think they're too large. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a link after the session, which can be shared with attendees, I think, with the slides, for you to be able to access the reports that came from all of those events. But I'm going to give you a couple of little interesting snippets of what we heard from attendees. So next slide, please. So we asked both sectors to talk about their concerns, their worries, their frustrations, and their issues with the other sector. So I think it was quite a brave thing to do. We were all in the same events, but it worked out really well. Everybody was very respectful with each other. So the concerns that we heard from domestic abuse specialists about mediation are here, and I'll read them out to you. So survivors have had face-to-face meetings when they have not really wanted them, but they felt that they couldn't say no. Mediation session being used by perpetrators to continue the abuse. Victims put under pressure to make decisions in mediation because they're often in a powerless position. Physical abuse is easy to recognise, but other forms of domestic abuse are not. A lack of confidence that mediators understand domestic abuse, in particular coercive and controlling behaviour, which is insidious and entrenched. Not confident that mediators would be able to spot that or deal with it appropriately. A lack of confidence that mediators can change the mediation process when a power imbalance has been identified. Where experiences have been positive, this is usually where domestic abuse has been historic, and most participants have gained emotional neutrality. In these cases, mediation is a helpful part of the process. What happens when a domestic abuse victim refuses mediation? Victims fear being seen as obstructive by refusing mediation. Their refusal is judged by the family court. Victims may agree to things in a shared space, which they may otherwise not agree to. And if their abuser is in the other room, they may still feel pressurised. So we also asked mediators what concerns they had about domestic abuse specialists. We were told that mediators are keen to develop links with local domestic abuse services, but many spoke of not receiving a positive response from domestic abuse services. Many domestic abuse workers do not have a clear understanding of how mediators work, their professional standards, and the different models of mediation which may be possible. Many domestic abuse workers may not know of the pressure sometimes placed upon mediators by clients who want to mediate, but for whom mediation may not be appropriate. And mediators are keen for co-working in specific cases to ensure families access the right support, but many have found it difficult to establish working links with local domestic abuse specialists. So domestic abuse specialists had stories, many stories of many situations where victim survivors had at best felt ignored and at worst coerced by the mediator involved. I have some of these stories myself from women that I used to support. However, we also heard mediators had found it hard or impossible to contact domestic abuse services to ask for assistance. And one mediator told us that a victim survivor had been told by their domestic abuse support worker that if they chose to go into mediation with their ex-partner, the domestic abuse service would close her case, which left her in a very unfair conundrum and does not promote the victim survivor's autonomy. So mediation is no longer just about two people sitting in the same room with a mediator, as Elaine's going to talk to us about in a moment. There are many mediation type practices available. And what I'm recognising and seeing, having now worked alongside and spoken to lots of mediators, is that they're increasingly flexible and creative around developing models which work for each particular set of circumstances. Next slide, please. So, when can mediation be a good process for victim survivors to engage with? So to answer this, I think we're straight back to autonomy. If a victim survivor is motivated to engage or enter into the mediation process, we should do our best to support it to happen safely. And if it can't be safe, then we, and I mean the domestic abuse sector, must work with mediators or on our own, if you like, with the victim survivor to help them to understand that this is unsafe, rather than just shutting down the conversation, help them to understand what the risk is and where the risk is. And when I say motivated to engage, I don't mean coerced with no choice, because they've maybe had a letter from the perpetrator's legal firm, or they think they might look unreasonable if they don't attend, or they may have been threatened into it. And it's really important that this distinction is made. And this is another reason why we need mediators and domestic abuse specialists speaking to each other. Because at that very, very early stage, the domestic abuse specialist is the best equipped person to ask the questions around coercion and also around motivation to undertake the mediation. Mediation should never be entered into as part of the coercion of the perpetrator. For me, that is the bottom line. But if a victim survivor feels that they are ready, with support to enter into a safe mediation process, domestic abuse services should be open to this conversation, as they can then work with their client to work out together if and how that can be safe. And shutting down that conversation is just not okay. It negates the victim survivor's autonomy. So if a victim survivor is motivated to enter into the mediation space, the domestic abuse specialist, the mediator, and the victim survivor all together should work together to make this safe to happen. And this actually might be part of their journey, the victim survivor's journey. They may finally feel that they're being listened to and heard through a mediation process, which done correctly can level out the power dynamics somewhat. And let us not forget the elephant in the room. Mediation can help to keep the victim from having to endure court, which I'm sure we're all aware does not promote the victim's autonomy. Doesn't really promote anybody's autonomy, I don't think. But we know this from a lot of research that's been supporting this argument. My research findings from my PhD supported those findings. If we can stay out of court, it is best for everybody. Of course, court may be necessary for some cases, but going straight to court without trying to find out whether there's anything else that a victim survivor for them can happen is doing them an injustice. So I'm going to pass over to Elaine now. She's going to tell you all about mediation processes and techniques, which you may not, those of you that are not mediators, may not know were available. And get the questions coming, please, if you don't mind. Thank you. Elaine.
Thanks very much, Liza. Next slide, please. So I'm glad we have this opportunity to think about other ways of resolving disputes for victim survivors of domestic abuse, rather than simply saying that they have to go to court, because one size doesn't fit all, and we need to consider all the safe options when a victim survivor is separating from a perpetrator. So the question is about mediation, and is it ever appropriate in cases of domestic abuse, and is court the only option? So my guiding principle, and I'm sure it's the same for all of you, is to do no harm. And that underpins all of my work with clients and in my training of lawyers and mediators. I'm not suggesting today or proposing doing anything that would undermine this first guiding principle. As family justice professionals, we're trained to be aware of power imbalances, safety concerns, coercion, lack of accountability of the perpetrator, and victim survivors being aware of their legal rights. It's also important to make the point that our assessment for domestic abuse runs like a thread throughout our work with victim survivors. The term screening, I find, is not helpful because it's not safe to complete a one-off tick box exercise at the beginning of work with a client and think that you're done. So all mediators come across domestic abuse. It's the nature of the job. And of course, we all know that it can be difficult to spot if it's not overt. We know that the basis of abuse is coercive and controlling behaviour, which shows itself in many different forms. Even if we don't have clarification of domestic abuse, we often work in cases involving high conflict personalities. So you'll see reference on this slide to the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, Nicole Jacobs. Improving the family justice system's response to domestic abuse is a priority for the Domestic Abuse Commissioner. And in July 23, a report was published called The Family Court and Domestic Abuse Achieving Cultural Change. I've put a link on the slide. The continuing major issues identified in the report for survivors of domestic abuse going through court are a lack of holistic support, a culture of disbelief, the minimisation of domestic abuse, the absence of the voice of the child, and the harmful effects current practice has on children. At the resolution conference in October 2023, I chaired a discussion about survivors of domestic abuse resolving issues using out-of-court dispute resolution. The audience of about 100 family law experts said yes by a large majority. I think the conclusions for many attending were the benefits of out-of-court dispute resolution, otherwise known as DR very often, for domestic abuse survivors include empowerment and autonomy, as Liza has said, that the court has many pitfalls for the victim survivor and DR can reduce trauma. DR can be more time efficient and cost effective. Co-parent relationships can be preserved, which could be important for the well-being of children, whilst also remembering that domestic abuse is child abuse, and that DR might be appropriate with safeguards in place, whilst also always proceeding with caution. One of the recommendation of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's report is that there should be specialist domestic abuse training to include the impact of domestic abuse on child and adult victims and survivors, which should include at a minimum the following elements: the nature of coercive control, the gendered dynamics of domestic abuse, the tactics a perpetrator will use to gain control and dominance over a survivor, and how family court applications can be used to perpetrate post-separation abuse. Next slide, please. Following on, following on from Liza's research, there's a really interesting study, the study I've referred to on this slide from 2020. It's American, and so they talk about intimate partner violence, IPV. But this is where, as you can see from the slide, it was a trial comparing shuttle mediation, which is often called separate spaces mediation, video conferencing, which is otherwise known as online mediation, and litigation. Both mediation approaches were perceived as safe by mediators, and parents felt safer and more satisfied in mediation than in traditional litigation. Mediators preferred separate spaces over online, and online cases were half as likely to reach agreement as cases in separate spaces. But what they didn't compare, of course, is the combination of online and separate spaces, which is the hybrid mediation model that I use, along with other trained and experienced family mediators. And I will explain what hybrid is on a later slide. Next slide, please. So I'm going to do a whirlwind tour of the mediation process now, starting with the mediation information and assessment meetings, known as MIAMs, and their individual, confidential pre-mediation meetings, and they're essential in the mediation process. So all mediations start with a MIAM, where it's assessed if mediation is appropriate. You may have heard reference to what's often known as the statutory MIAM, and this enables a court application to be made. In my experience, though, most people who come to see me for a MIAM are there because they have a genuine interest in using the mediation process to resolve their issues. So the referrals can be made from a family law practitioner, and they can be self-referrals. MIAMs must do the following. They must provide information. You must obtain information. You must assess safety of and suitability for the participant. So this is the start of the assessment for domestic abuse and links to the next essential element of a MIAM, which is to identify next steps. So the aims are for a safe and confidential space, the assessment of suitability, and options to be identified. So you'll see from the slide that reference is made to the FMSB FMC. So that stands for Family Mediation Standards Board and the Family Mediation Council. MIAM working group. So I was a member of this working group, and we spent a lot of time over the sort of 18 months that we were meeting, discussing the issues that arise when mediators are dealing with domestic abuse. So the purpose of the new MIAM standards is to maintain consistent delivery of high quality best practice, to ensure protection of the public, to protect ethical practice based on the principles of mediation, and to establish reliable suitability for mediation. So in order to assess safety and suitability, mediators in the pre-mediation meeting should be alert to behaviours that are indicative of domestic abuse. And if domestic abuse is apparent, they assess how the mediation could be impacted and affect discussions. Mediators assess if undue distress will be caused through the mediation process and therefore suitability to mediate. I always start my pre-mediation meetings by saying that although the meeting is confidential, there are exceptions to this, and I then explain my safeguarding duties from the outset of the meeting. I asked this question on my preliminary information form. This is a form which participants complete and return to me before the MIAM. I say, mediation can be conducted with both of you present together in one virtual room. Does this create any concerns for you? As a guide, can you disagree, challenge, speak up for yourself without feeling threatened, intimidated, or worried about reprisals, either during or after mediation? And the answer can be yes, no, or not sure. I always ask this question again during the meeting itself. And it's interesting because the answer often changes from what the person has put on the form to what they then say towards the end of the meeting when we've had a thorough discussion. During the MIAM, mediators are also looking out for issues with drug or alcohol addictions, issues of child protection or any other safeguarding concerns, any other vulnerabilities present such as mental health, intellectual capacity, disability, emotional readiness. And we consider the support of others to attend the mediation that may be required. Next slide, please. I want to speak about how classic or traditional family mediation can be used in cases of domestic abuse. All mediators should be trained to recognise domestic abuse and assess for it. In classic family mediation, participants are often in the same room and share everything. This has disadvantages in a domestic abuse and high conflict situation. It's not safe. It will be very challenging to manage. It will be traumatic and triggering for a victim survivor. The perpetrator can continue to manipulate and cause harm, and it's highly likely that the process will quickly break down. It's important to know that mediation is flexible and bespoke. So, for example, that idea of that's how it always is in a mediation meeting, that everyone sits together and it's all transparent, it doesn't have to be like that. So mediation can take place with participants sitting in separate spaces, both in person and online. This is often called shuttle mediation. Online mediation, of course, has the advantage of the person who's attending not having to worry about travel, unfamiliar offices, and safe entry and exit to and from the mediation meetings. Online mediation's really taken off since the pandemic, as you can imagine. So in mediation, participants can bring lawyers and other supporters into the mediation when it's in separate spaces. Two mediators can co-mediate when appropriate to do so. However, of course, this does have cost implications and is not used as often as the one mediator model. I wanted to talk a little bit about what hybrid mediation involves, which is an advanced technique. Hybrid mediation works by allowing both participants to have confidential separate spaces to engage in individual discussions with the mediator. They can each express concerns to the mediator and rehearse offers without the other person hearing and reacting. Excuse me. Lawyers can often attend so they can advise and support their clients in real time, and lawyers assist with the negotiations. IDVAs, divorce coaches, financial neutrals, and therapists can also attend. Hybrids often used in complex finance cases, when requiring separate spaces, if there are particular personality traits, when there's an inability to understand, in cases of intimidation, when there's a request to have a legal advisor present, and when negotiations become stuck. From experience, I can say it's the best form of mediation that I've used to manage domestic abuse and high conflict, where it is safe and appropriate to do so, because it's so flexible and a bespoke process for each separating couple can be created. The victim survivor is protected and supported. Next slide, please. So, how to bridge the gap, as this slide indicates. The advantages of mediation for victim survivors of domestic abuse, the fact that the mediation process is voluntary. You don't have to do it. Nobody is being forced to do it. It goes back to that issue of autonomy that Liza was speaking about. It's flexible and bespoke. There can be separate spaces. It can be online. It's confidential. Mediators are trained. The mediator assesses the two participants, and this was an important point that I wanted to make, because mediators have the advantage of working with both people from a separating couple. So, of course, I'm looking out for one of three possible scenarios. Person A says that person B is abusive, and that turns out to be correct. Or the second scenario, where person A says that person B is abusive, and it turns out that it's actually person A that's abusive. And thirdly, the possibility that they're both abusive. Of course, this is a more difficult exercise when you're working with one client rather than two. Quite apart from keeping people safe, another reason that we need to identify and understand abuse and high conflict dynamics is because special strategies will be needed. The usual ones will not work, usually make matters worse, and are counterproductive. Next slide, please. Thanks very much for listening, and we can now take some questions, hopefully. Liza, have you been checking the Q&A?
Oh, wow. I don't have access to the Q&A. I've been trying to find it. I think it's because I've not signed into my Zoom. So I've got very limited. I've got the chat. Obviously, we've asked to put everything in the Q&A. So I don't know if you've got it, Elaine.
Can we take the slides down, Julie, and then I can check and see what I can see on my screen? No, I don't have anything in my chat. And
I mean, if there's any questions that anyone put in the Q&A and you're brave enough to say them with your voice, then if you could raise your virtual hand if you know how to do that on Zoom, we can take them from you. If not, maybe Julie's got the Q&A on hers.
yeah, I was just going to say, Julie might be able to let us have the Q&A.
Hello, sorry, the voice from the ether. There is no Q&A because it's set up as a meeting, but there will be
Okay.
chat. And I've just seen someone has put something in the chat.
Oh, great.
But it was that there isn't a question.
Brilliant. Okay.
Joe, thanks very much. You found it useful. That's great. Anyone else want to start a conversation? Oh, great. Missy. Yes, please ask a question.
Sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question. I just wanted to find out, Liza, in terms of your research, what was done in terms of the response by those in African Caribbean cultures, because yeah, it's something that I'm quite interested in, coming from an African Caribbean culture myself, but also that's what I wanted to ask. How many women did you access regarding, because usually what tends to happen is it's kind of really entrenched in the culture. So yeah, I just wanted to find out what your thoughts are on that. I'm going to mute myself now because there's a lot going on in my house at the moment.
No
but
worries. No worries.
and I may contact you actually
Yeah.
afterwards. Yeah, thank
Of
you.
course, yes, please do. So my research, my PhD research was very small, as PhD research often is. I had 8 women but the point of the research was around case studies. So I took interviews with them, but also all of their case notes from police files, family court, MARACs, domestic abuse services, children's social care. So the research was really intense, if you like, based on 8 mothers, 2 of which didn't complete, so really 6 mothers. And I'm ashamed to say that it wasn't a very good cross section at all. It was based upon the area that I was in, working in at the time, and we put out requests for anybody that was willing to speak to me, victim survivors that are willing to speak to me, and they were all white British. So it's not an intersectional review at all. And my research, and I obviously I caveat that very heavily at the beginning of the research, is that this is a very small scale piece of research, and it was more about examining the case notes and the language that was used by professionals when they were responding to or not responding to or whatever serve the client. And actually one of my recommendations was this should be extended and expanded to take account of ethnicities, sexualities, if you like, as well, but like so it could make up more of a demographic across a demographic, because it was very small scale. But Bissy, please do contact me, because the findings can be applied, and somebody hopefully would be great if somebody could extend that to look at other groups, potentially in cultures. But that was a really good question.
No, you're welcome. Thank you, and I will do, Liza. Were you here last year? Because I think I wanted to contact you. No,
I didn't do 2022. I do not know where the time has gone, because I felt
no, I
like I
don't.
did, but it was 2021, and I've just lost 2
Yes,
years of
I
my life
remember.
about.
Yes, yeah, I remember you, and I was actually going to email you, and 2 years later, I haven't. So
I'm on
I
your
will.
to-do list.
You definitely are. No, thank you for that, and I will be in contact. Thank you very much.
Fabulous, please do. Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Glad you've met up now. I see that Emma Owens has got a hand up.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Emma.
Hello. I actually work for the Citizens Advice Bureau, and we make a lot of referrals, domestic abuse cases. I'm just interested to know, I'm looking at the list of harms that you outlined at the beginning of your presentation. Is it something that's now a specialist area that people have to train to a different level in mediation to be safely referred? Or is it something across the board that mediators are now, a safe place for domestic violence sufferers to receive referrals to mediation?
What a great question. And I think me and Elaine would have different ways of answering that. I'm going to let Elaine go first.
Well, thanks, Liza. I would say, Emma, that all mediators are trained. When they do their basic foundation training, they will all have some training about domestic abuse. And if it's a mediator who's come from a lawyer background, they will also have domestic abuse and safeguarding training. But all mediators should have that training. And I just think possibly that we need to tighten it up a bit more. So it's been quite interesting working, training for Resolution, because Resolution have just introduced a new model of one lawyer working with a separating couple. This is not in areas of domestic abuse or high conflict at all, but it's where a separating couple are very agreeable and just want the lawyer to perhaps write up a consent order for them. Now, in order to be sort of qualified and under the Resolution Together model, everyone who's doing that training through Resolution has to attend an all-day domestic abuse course, because it's been recognised that they have to spot where there's a power imbalance, where there's possibly domestic abuse, before they take instructions from the separating couple to act for them in that capacity. So I think that it would be really helpful if we could have more domestic abuse training, and if it could be more regular, and if there could be, you know, training every few years. It's not just something that you do as a one-off, but something that is regular and is incorporated. But in theory, all mediators will have had domestic abuse and safeguarding training, although it's a question of to what degree. And but I would say, as I said in the presentation, that we do all come across it very, very regularly, as do all family law professionals. So we should be experienced in spotting it and how to deal with it. And Sheena Adam has very helpfully put in the chat that mediators are required to have ongoing DA training as part of accreditation. Thanks, Sheena.
Thank you for that, Sheena. Training is something that we've talked about a lot in the Mediation Domestic Abuse Network. It's something that's been raised at each of the events. It's something we talk about internally amongst ourselves, because training is just this like catch-all word for lots of potentially not very good stuff and just potentially really good stuff. It's really about who delivers the training, you know, whether the training does what it should do, and whether people actually engage with that training or just turn up and tick some boxes. I think learning and understanding about domestic abuse, and I would say coercive and controlling behaviour, because it is so nuanced, is an ongoing commitment that needs to, and not just for mediators, you know, people working within the domestic abuse world are still learning as we go every day. I'm always very reluctant to believe someone who says they're an expert. People introduce me as an expert. I'm not an expert. The women and men, the people that are living with the abuse are the experts. They're the ones that have kept themselves safe to this point. And I think the important thing that we learn is that we need to listen to them, recognize the signs, and then know what to do with that information. And I think it can be very dangerous when people feel that they can solve it all in their own silo, whether that be a mediator, whether that be even a domestic abuse specialist. Everybody has to work together. As I said earlier, we're interconnected as human beings. So domestic abuse training is literally the tip of the iceberg. It's important. It needs to be done for part of the accreditation, etc. But it is about this ongoing thirst for knowledge and understanding, and not being the person that stands there and says, well, I know everything about domestic abuse because I've been on a 2-day training course or a day training course. I've worked in domestic abuse for a long time and I don't know everything about domestic abuse. You know, I get surprised every single day of my work. And so, yeah, I think it's difficult to legislate for that, and it's difficult to make that into a policy. That only people that are interested in how human beings work should be in certain roles. But what I would say, a little bit of a plug really, is that I do deliver coercive and controlling behaviour training, very specifically about coercive and controlling behaviour, with the FMA twice a year to mediators. And I think we've had some lawyers join us as well. So anyone that's a member of the FMA, or I don't know how you get onto it, I have no clue. I just turn up and do my thing. But it's an opportunity for specifically for mediators to ask the questions, what does that mean for their practice? And I use case studies and real life stuff in that training. So yeah, it's a very good question. It's something that we keep trying to get to grips with. What does that actually mean? What does it even mean, training?
Yeah, that's a really good reply as well, Liza. Very comprehensive. And I think just to add to that, this is all part of us being reflective practitioners. So it's that ongoing thirst for learning and improvement, and being able to reflect back on what your current training needs are, which definitely all mediators are encouraged to do.
Yeah. And don't assume that you know everything. And I think that's the problem. And as Bissy has said, it's about everybody. This is not just about mediators. This is about anyone that works with people, that comes in contact with people. It's important that we don't get to the point where we think we know best. We don't.
Yeah, always learning. And Bissy, that's fantastic that you've put in the chat that reference to the Freedom Programme. I use that in all of my trainings, and I also use it with mediation clients who come to see me, you know, the Dominator book has been a favourite of mine for years, and I particularly like all the lovely little cartoons that go with it, and I use them on my slides in training. And of course, Pat Craven is a Scouser, so she's near to me, dear to my heart.
Yes, she's a great character.
Yeah. Anyone else with questions? Or Liza and I might just start talking between ourselves.
Yeah, that'll be it then, and the session will end, and we'll still be going. We'll still be going. Okay, what Amity Relationship Solutions? I don't know who they are, but I'm sure that's a mediation, people with mediation that deliver training on the difference between domestic abuse and parental conflict.
They're actually just an independent organisation who've done a lot of training for health visitors, teachers, local authority workers, but trying to understand what's parental conflict that you can work with and what's severe domestic abuse that you shouldn't be working with, I think is a really good course, actually.
Yeah, that is very helpful, and I think back to basics, back to the reason why I'm here, and back to the Mediation Domestic Abuse Network. Actually, if you've got an inkling and you've just got a clue or a worry, what I would be encouraging you to do is to contact and speak to your domestic abuse services. And if the local ones aren't going to speak to you because you're a mediator, shame on them. Send them my way, and I'll have a chat. But otherwise, I was about to open up the floodgate and contact me. Don't contact me because I'm very busy. Although if you do, I probably will respond. That's the problem. But there are national services, so Refuge nationally. I'm sure if you contacted them and said, I need to speak to somebody about some advice about this case, it's a bit, we call it the grey areas. It's a bit of a grey area. I'm not too sure whether it's safe. I'm not too sure what the situation is. They don't have a domestic abuse worker. Refer them into a local service if they give consent for you to do that. We don't want anybody trying to sort this out on their own, because it's not the role of a mediator to have to do that. You have a job to do and they have a job to do. And if you do your jobs together, it makes it safe for that victim survivor that's in the middle. It's important that you do the training and learn what the difference. But if you're not sure, it's always best. Two heads are definitely better than one.
And really, the ideal situation would be if you're working with a victim survivor that they bring the IDVA into the mediation with them. I mean, and then you're doing, the way I would see it working is that it's a mediation where it's potentially online, sitting in separate spaces. Of course, the great thing about online is that I can do meetings with people who are geographically in quite different places. So the IDVA and the victim survivor can be sitting in one room, perpetrator can be sitting in another room. The victim survivor will never hear or see the perpetrator during the course of the mediation meeting. And I often talk about that to people in the pre-mediation meetings to reassure them, because that's a question I get asked regularly.
Yeah. Gone are the days of everyone sitting in one room in that horrible awkwardness.
Yeah. And just the whole difficulty about getting people safely in and out of buildings. I mean,
been there, done that one.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, things have moved on a lot. Is there any other questions? Oh, does the other party have to agree for IDVA to attend? That's a really good question, actually.
No, I wouldn't be. It's my process. So I will explain to everybody who comes into a pre-mediation meeting with me that they are the decision makers, but I'm in charge of the process. So it's my process, and I take responsibility for that. And
if the other party didn't want to engage at that point, I think that tells us a lot, doesn't it?
Yes,
that
it
gives
does.
us a little bit of insight into the power dynamic issue.
But the perpetrator may well want to have their own supporter with them. That wouldn't surprise me. Of course, it's great when potentially if you're working in a hybrid meeting and both parties agree that they can bring their lawyers in, for example, because lawyers who are well trained and supporting the mediation process can just be such a brilliant help. And sometimes you can be so surprised as a mediator. Usually it's cases where you think, oh goodness, this is never going to settle, and then lo and behold it does. And I can think of one situation in particular where I was dealing with a doctor, a female doctor who'd suffered abuse from her husband. There was one child involved. They'd spent 2 years in court very unsatisfactorily. And they decided to come to mediation to resolve the finances. They sat in separate spaces throughout, and each went away with what they had hoped to achieve, which was amazing. And I think what has happened really, and I do see this happening on quite a few occasions, where people who've had experience of going to court and have been so disillusioned by it then turn to mediation.
Yeah, it's just a shame that it has to go that way, because that's a lot of money, a lot of distress, time, and yeah, it's very
be really
about
unsafe.
conflict, isn't it? Yeah.
So Ali Bradley, what's the best way to engage with domestic abuse agencies to discuss that mediation in the right circumstances could be safe for a victim survivor? Good question, Ali.
Ali, if you're coming up against barriers, then maybe use the language of promotion of autonomy, or promotion of, I want to, because obviously you would have spoken to or had contact with the person who wants to do mediation. So you probably would have had maybe even the MIAM at that point, I don't know. But for you to know that person wants to do mediation, they've told you enough about the situation that you think it might be problematic. Just use that language of, that this person wants to do it and I'm wanting your help as a domestic abuse specialist to be able to make that safe. I don't want to proceed without it being safe. Working together. The domestic abuse world is very, very attuned to working in multi-agency. We have to do that. If we don't ever work, we can't work in silo. It's not possible. So they're already set up to do that. And I think if you speak their language, and understand that this is something that you're asking for help with the victim at the center of that, and it's being about the victim, being very victim focused. I really would, and maybe I'm wrong, but I would be really surprised if you had a real push against that. You're not telling them this is happening regardless. You're not telling them how to do their jobs. You're asking them for help, which is actually what domestic abuse specialists do. They help. So yeah, I think it's the language. And if you're working across the country, then you would need to go online and look for the local service, the service that's potentially local to that victim survivor, because the hope is that you start a relationship with that between the two of them. So it would need to be their local service.
That's what I do, Liza, in the pre-mediation meeting. When domestic abuse arises, then I do a search online with the victim survivor during the meeting to find the local service. And I always leave them, their one next step is to get in touch with the service. So I'll give them the telephone number, the website, any email contact addresses, what time they're open, etc., and really encourage them to go.
Yeah.
And then really, I suppose the important thing is for us to get the message out to those domestic abuse agencies that they're so welcome to come and support a victim survivor in mediation. I think that's the big message that we need to get out.
Yeah. Good question. Lots of very good questions today.
Yeah.
Any others before we finish?
Oh, a new message.
Very exciting.
Oh, Beverly. Hi, Beverly. One of your cases was a massive empowerment of the victim survivor after some very serious domestic abuse, with lots of cautions and protections put in place. It's still a case which sends a tingle down my spine. It was so successful. And that is amazing, Beverly, because it is that feeling that you get, definitely. That case that I was talking about, the reason I remember it so clearly is that I sort of have it as one of my best successful cases. So yeah, tingle down the spine moment is definitely a good description. But again, talking about empowerment, it's so important. Autonomy, empowerment, all those things that have been taken away from that victim survivor. It's just so important. And when it works well, it can be brilliant. And if it's not going to work, then as long as things have been safe, you've lost nothing. And even just a meeting with a pre-mediation meeting, I find with a victim survivor can just be so helpful. I'm thinking now of a woman I met with a few weeks ago where her husband had been convicted of child sexual abuse offences online, and he had been imprisoned, and he was out of prison having served his sentence. And social services were involved with the 2 children, but no one had picked up that actually the wife had been abused in all of this. And so you, as a mediator, you are the first noticer. So I was able then to help her and get her linked up with a domestic abuse organisation, get her linked up with a specialist domestic abuse family lawyer. And she has been in touch with me since, because I keep saying whatever I can do to help you. So she's asked me about filling in her financial forms, and I'm really just so delighted that I've been helpful.
Yeah, that's great. We've got another question, and I think this is probably going to be the last one, from Joan. She's asked, I wonder what you think about men carrying out domestic abuse screening on women who are from Eastern cultures in particular. So do you mean screening a domestic abuse specialist doing the screening, or a mediator doing the screening? Joan, are you able to unmute yourself or type it? I mean, the blanket answer to that is that if a woman is not comfortable with whoever's in front of them, whether that be a mediator or a domestic abuse specialist, they need someone else to do it, is the blanket answer. Basically, it doesn't really matter who it is we're talking about here. And any woman from any culture, in any situation, who may have trauma responses to men, or, whatever it is, the victim, survivor, person, woman, whoever, should be in the driving seat there, because that is about promoting their autonomy, actually.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a whole other subject about trauma-informed practice, which we definitely need a few more hours
for,
I
next
think.
year. No.
Yeah. Well, I think we're about to wind it up. We've just got a couple of minutes to go. So I just want to say thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And I hope that we'll be able to have another opportunity to do something similar, Liza. It's been great to work with you.